In this project, we're going to use the web browser control to display websites. And on the left-hand side, I have a panel that has 6 labels with images in those labels that serve as basically buttons. And I can click any one of these and see the website appear in the web browser. Now, word of caution here, this web browser in Visual Studio 2019 is based on an older version of Internet Explorer and doesn't support the more modern websites very well. So some things don't show up as well as we'd like, and some things just don't show up at all, such as YouTube. So I have a little button down here for YouTube, and it basically doesn't display anything. Part of it may be that because of the browser, it goes to go to the mobile version. I'm not sure if that's the issue. And if I just try changing this and just say youtube.com, it still reverts back to the mobile version. But various buttons here that we can look at in terms of things maybe dealing with school. And then up here on there's a menu bar with categories, and I just simply put in school, C#, and Android development. So when I click C#, these labels change. These are dynamic, and we're going to use a class to control what the websites are for these different labels when we click them. Now here's another one. This is also YouTube, and of course nothing shows up here for our C# playlist. But I did have it show the URL here, and then I added 3 buttons to display the URL in either Edge, Chrome, or Firefox. So if I click Edge, I can have the website appear in Microsoft Edge and everything works fine. So that's a way around the limitations of the C# web browser control. And of course I can watch it in Chrome or Firefox. Some sites show up pretty well. This particular one for the cheat sheet is a PDF, and simply is just a little bit larger file and takes a while for it to load, so you have to be kind of patient on this one. And then the final category is Android development. And again, some websites show up really well, and others not so much. Since I tend to use Google a lot, I added a button for Google, and of course the one for YouTube, which doesn't really display correctly. This is a text box. We can type in a website. And click the Go button. It'll take us to that site. So we're not limited to what's in the buttons here. The only thing this does not have is a history, and I could have added a stack of all the sites visited and pop those off the stack to go backwards. That might be something you want to add in later. There's also a zoom feature here where we can zoom in or zoom out. And I put this in here because the display on the web browser is based on some settings in Windows, and it's, for the most part, pages were showing up at 200% and it just didn't look good. There is a document loaded handler that as soon as the document is loaded, it changes it to 100% by default. That was one of the little gotchas I had as I was playing around with this and developing this. So that is our project. Let me walk you through the creation of it. In Canvas, I'm going to provide you a zip file that has all this information in it. There's a folder here called Site Logos, and it contains JPEGs of the different icons that we're using in those labels as the buttons. These are labeled A1 through A6, B1 through B6, and C1 through C6. These correspond to the 3 different panels or the outlay of those buttons in the panels. When you import these into your image list, they will be in that order. So this will become index 0, index 1, index 2, and so forth. And we'll use those indexes in our labels. I also am going to provide the icons for the Chrome, Edge, and Firefox logos for the small buttons, as well as the logos for Google and YouTube. And of course the YouTube doesn't work, but we can still put it in. I created these in Photoshop as different layers, so I'm going to give you the Photoshop file if you wanted to create your own. These are the site logos are all 150 by 75 pixels. And the logos one here are the Google and the YouTube. There's an Excel file that I used for the URLs for each of the 18 websites that correspond to our site logos. And then I made a CSV version of it. I'm going to open that with Notepad. So it's comma separated. We have our index numbers 0 through 17. That's our 18 different buttons. And then the URL of the site that each of those correspond to. We're going to read this into a class called site.cs, and then we'll use that in managing the images and the URLs that they correspond to from our different labels. You want to make sure you put the CSV file in your bin debug folder with the executable that you create. All right, let's jump over to Visual Studio. I have a form that I set the size to 1250 by 700. Figuring a 1280 by 720 display, a little bit smaller to allow for the frame. I added a menu bar across the top with two menus of categories, which contain school, C#, and Android development. In Zoom, which I set for 100%, 75, 50, 125, 150, and 200%. The focal point of this, of course, is the web browser control, which is here in the common controls at the bottom. And the web browser, I set to kind of eyeballed it. Mine's 1053 by 558. More importantly, though, I set the anchor to top, bottom, left, and right, leaving some space on the left-hand side and space at the top. So at the top we have a label, a text box for our URL, the Go button, which I named BTN Go, and then this is BTN Edge, BTN Chrome, and BTN, should be BTN Firefox. I'll go ahead and name it BTN Firefox. Then on the left-hand side I have a panel, and my panel, I size mine to 168 by 556. You could probably do 170 maybe by 555. And then I put 6 labels in here that are each 150 by 75. That's the size of my images that we're going to display here. Give them each a border style of fixed single. Got rid of the text. I used the layout button bar to evenly space these out. And a little margin at the bottom and the top. I also have a text box here. That text box is named LBL header, and that's going to display, am I looking at the school, I'm looking at C#, I'm looking at Android. I named my buttons LBL A1, A2, A3, down through A6. Originally I was thinking about having 3 different panels, 1A, 1B, 1C, and then I got a little bit wiser of let's just dynamically change what these buttons display and what sites they go to. And I did that through a added class that I named site.cs. It's just a very simple data class. 2 properties, img index for image index and site URL. And then my constructor is simply passing it an IDX integer variable and a site string variable, and then I set those to our 2 properties. One thing I should point out, by doing the anchor here, we can resize our application, maybe go full screen from like a 1920 by 1280, and you'll still leave the space here for our buttons and the top, but the web browser will expand accordingly or shrink accordingly. All right, let's take a look at the code. So I did add a using system.io. We're going to read in that CSV data file. I created a list of my site class called My Sites, and one called Site Labels that is a list of labels. In Form 1, I created a temp labels of those 6 labels, LBL A1 through A6, and then I inserted those into my Site Labels empty list. Call a method called populate sites. We'll look at that in a second. I'm going to set buttons. I have another method here called set buttons. I'm going to pass it a 0 and the word schools. We're going to start with the indexes 0 through 5. It's all retained to school things, and that'll set those labels up accordingly with the proper image and the proper link to our URL. Now, because that web browser is old, I was getting a lot of script errors coming up. Doesn't necessarily play well with some JavaScript stuff or other scripts. So I added a site here, web browser 1, that was the name of my web browser, .script errors suppressed equals true. So we don't show those errors. Now here's the populate sites. I'm going to open up a file called sites.csv. It's just coming out of the same folder as our executable. Using a stream reader, we're going to clear my sites in case you want to reload this again. I'm going to create a string array called XYZ. This can contain 2 items. And then I'm going to read line by line. I'm going to split on the comma, and int idx is going to equal int.parse the first element of XYZ, which is element 0, and then mysites.add. I'm going to add a new site, passing it IDX as our integer, and then the second item, which is element 1 of XYZ. Close my project. I had a message box here to make sure that everything was loading correctly. I commented that out once I knew that things were coming in okay. Now that set buttons up here, passing it 0 and the word school, here's our set buttons, and it has int called offset and string called header. Now the offset is looking at a counter from 0 through 5. How much do I want to add to that? I'm going to start with 0. So if adding 0 to 0, it's going to be 0. Adding 0 to 5 is going to be 5. So in this case, so we got a little loop here. I'm going to loop through that 6 times, going from 0 to 5. And then I'm going to take that counter of I and add the offset to it and set the image index of my label element I, which is going to be LBL A1 through A5 or A6, and set the image index accordingly. When I want to load that second panel of CSharp, we're going to set the offset to 6. It's going to load images 6 through 11. And the next time for the Android, the offset will be 12. I also set the header text to whatever's being passed there. So that allows me to recycle that panel and the buttons using my site.cs. Now my 3 menu items, school, CSharp, and Android, simply set those buttons accordingly with the offset and the text. Each of those 6 buttons has a click event that calls go URL. And we're going to get the sender as a label, find what that click target was. We're going to get the index of that click target as being the image index. That will be 0 through 17. And then I'll use that index number to pull the appropriate site URL from our sites class that is contained within my sites, that list. I'm going to try to load the URL. And if there's an exception, we'll show the exception. Actually, none of them show exceptions, even though they don't always work. But it's good to have that in there. Once that document is completed, let me jump back over here. So on the browser, if we look at the events here, there is a document completed event. There's also a navigated event called show URL. So I use both of those. Here's the web document completed, and I'm simply setting the document.body style to zoom 100%. For the Google button, I'm navigating to google.com. In our web browser, YouTube, I try navigating to youtube.com. Again, that one doesn't work. You might want to substitute something else there that you use frequently that might be more appropriate. But you can go to YouTube and then click, of course, the Edge, the Firefox, or the Chrome buttons to get there really quickly. Those zoom menu items all call a set browser zoom method. And again, I'm going to use sender as a tool strip menu item. I'm going to get this text that was part of that menu item, create a string of zoom colon and the text percent and a semicolon. Notice up here, that's within the string, zoom colon 100% semicolon. And I'm going to set the web browser one document style to that zoom level string. The web browser, when it navigates, calls this show URL, and I'm simply showing the URL in the txt URL label above the web browser. Here's my 3 buttons for Edge, Chrome, and this one was the Firefox. And all we're doing here is starting a system process of the name of the browser and the URL that is in that text box named txt URL. So Edge, Chrome, Firefox. The Go button at the end of that text box simply navigates to the text that's in the txt URL. And that is my code. going to run this one more time. Here then is my project. It loads the school panel with the 6 buttons using the information from that site, my sites list based on the site's class. And if I just click Google here, I could actually type something into Google. Let's just look for Maricopa. And I'm going to go to Maricopa Community Colleges, and it brings up that site. So I can use the Google to get it anywhere. I could also use this URL. And just to demonstrate that if I were to make this larger, the web browser goes larger, as well as if I make it smaller. And you make it smaller, you might want to do a smaller zoom. Full screen, and we'll go back to 100%. That's our project. Have fun with this. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C-Sharp Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.